Good evening, everybody. Welcome to this insightful session on cybersecurity excellence and the new framework introduced by SEBI, basically on the cyber resilience. A very important topic to be discussed on a financial ecosystem perspective. Cyber threats have been evolving at an unprecedented pace with the increased digital dependency in the financial market. Resilience is no longer an option, but it is an imperative tool. Financial sector is a prime target for such cyber criminals, and given the vast amounts of the data, the real-time transaction, and also the interconnected systems, um, a single breach can disrupt the whole organization. Um, the idea is not only the stability of the entire market, but also an appropriate regulatory scrutiny and a reputational damage which can be saved along with the financial losses. Recognizing this risk, SEBI has taken a very proactive step by introducing the framework. It's a comprehensive framework designed to enhance cybersecurity, governance, risk management, and also there is a mention about how the incidents have to be reported, the response to that incidents across the participations. Unlike previous regulations, which were there in 2018 or prior to that, the framework is having a graded approach, which uh, basically talks about the size, the exposure, the risk, the entities that would be having, and also the measures that they will be putting across in order to mitigate those risks. What we are going to discuss today, how this framework is going to be operated in the Indian financial markets, what are our key compliance requirements, how the entities are going to prepare for the deadlines that have been mentioned by the SEBI. Our guest speaker today and our expert on the panel, Mr. Nara, will be talking about how do we implement those strategies, what are the best practices, potential challenges, etc. A quick introduction about Narasimhan. We call him Nara as he's famous for. He's a highly rated cybersecurity auditor, a keynote speaker on various platforms. Nara comes with a specialization in cybersecurity audit, SOC compliances, any other emerging technologies such as AI, etc. He's recognized at pan-India level for various contributions to cyber risk management and governance on this platform. Without further ado, we jump to the topic. Um, Whereas before going into the nitty-gritties of the topic, I think a few news carve-outs that we have which we have brought out, I think, which will help us understand why cybersecurity is the need of the hour. Cyber threats have been very critical in order to uh, uh, disrupt the infrastructure that have been built by this financial organization in order to protect and also to um, mitigate the risk that have been exposed through because of the cyber crimes. SEBI has introduced the cyber resilience framework. Um, this has painted a very clear picture that the regulator wants the institutes and the businesses to either mitigate the risk or bring in steps in order to uh, provide a resilient approach in order to safeguard their data, their financial informations, etc. From financial frauds to cybersecurity attacks, the threats have been evolving at a greater pace. I was reading somewhere where the World Economic Forum reports were discussing that the threats are a larger risk to the economy rather than certain other war crimes, etc. Um, uh, Quoting some Times of India reports where they were talking about some 100 crore scam, uh, very famous startups, promoters, etc., talking about the cybersecurity deficiencies or the concerns that they feel in the sector. I think SEBI's framework would be the right point to answer those questions that have been raised by the industry themselves. Speaking about the numbers, I think over 3,000 complaints have been received. There is a cyber security storm, which has been paused before various businesses. I think that makes more sense in order to bring such a framework and strengthen the security, the risk which are being exposed from the organization perspective in the cybersecurity domain. I quickly go to the next slide. Why cybersecurity is important? Because we are facing so many threats. We are rising based on the digital platforms, the algorithms, the cloud-based information. Cybersecurity becomes a top priority for the regulators as well as the entities which are regulated. So financial markets which are operating in such an environment are exposed to phishing attacks, ransomwares, insider threats, and such vulnerabilities related to the cyber industry or the cyber world, basically, which can disrupt their stability and also erode the confidence that the investor have been putting into the financial ecosystem. SEBI, as a regulator, has been observing those gaps, and I think the framework has brought in a lot of structure and a framework in order to uh, introduce governance, risk-based approach, and also standardized approach to control those securities. From time to time, I think SEBI has kept on updating their regulations. We will see a few bits of those regulations in our upcoming discussion with Nara. I'll put across some questions, and Nara would throw his insights uh, uh, on those approaches or the questions that we would pose before him. A quick introduction about Nara on this, and I just jump to the question and answer session. So, Nara, welcome to our In.Talks webinar. Uh, it is always great to chat with you on cybersecurity and system-related discussions. Especially today's topic, I think, is focused more on the AIFs. Um, can you help us understand how SEBI has been working on this cybersecurity, cyber awareness, and how does this framework altogether will bring in something which is different from the earlier versions which were there in the domain?
Sure. Thanks, Meet, for setting the context and giving the background. Very warm evening to all the participants. I know on one side you have an interesting match going on there. So thanks for taking your time off to attend this conversation and upgrade yourself in terms of what's happening. So just to give you a perspective, and I think the slide following will give you some clarity there. The whole thing, what SEBI has done is not something new, but rather it has brought it into a more structured and a universally applicable code, right? A code would be much more comprehensive than that of a small piece of a requirement. To give a simple perspective, in the 2018, right, is when the typical circulars such as this were already insisted. And what happened was in the 2018 requirements, it was predominantly focused on a few players like the stock market, exchange, right, or stock market exchange, depository participants, and maybe to some extent mutual funds. But then the 2024 has expanded the scope to literally all the players. And I will speak about the players probably in a subsequent slide, right? And there was no clear emphasis on what is called as resilience related requirements. Whereas the 2024 focuses predominantly on resilience. And to just give a resilience in a simpler language, it is ability of an organization to withstand a cyber attack and still continue or still be able to make it a little further. That if there is an attack, if despite that I'm able to effectively stop it, and even though I have a downtime, the downtime is minimal, right? And I'll still be able to go ahead. And for the first time, let me be very, very clear that we have come up with what is called as a graded approach, because it is understood that not every organization can have the same set of requirements. And nowhere in any of the regulations relating to cyber across India, you will find this. So the first time SEBI came up with a graded approach, which said, if you follow under this category, these are your requirements. If you follow under this category, these are your requirements. That's a massive shift. And of course, they've also brought in some advanced measures like SOC monitoring, which is mandatory, VAPT, post-quantum related risk in case people are using quantum computing and other technologies, right? And it also has initiated something called efficacy audits. So these are broadly, a major set of difference. And not to forget, whenever you name a guideline, it always has a requirement for cyber audits. So there is a requirement for cyber audits regularly, which is both ISO 27001 and some other cyber audits. We'll speak about it as we go. Back to you.
Perfect. Perfect. Got it. So basically, this is much more matured version of the frameworks which have been available in the domain, and I think the regulators are also evolving with the changes in the financial ecosystem altogether. So that brings me to the next question: how is this framework aligned with the matured goals that are being evolved in the whole ecosystem, and how are they aligned with the objectives that the SEBI was always wanting to bring with this
Good
framework?
question. Good question. In terms of the key goals and objectives, right? SEBI has probably cleared or stuck on to what is called as the NIST framework of the US, which is basically given from the regulator standpoint. It is benchmarked with that and try to come up with a large extent of customization based on Indian setup. While on one side, the objectives I think we spoke of, right, is basically give you a better flavor of security, make sure that the resilience is an objective, right? Standardize the cybersecurity practices, make sure that everybody are going same way, promote the risk management, right? Streamline the incident reporting. And incident over here refers to any sort of a breach, any sort of a issue or a loss of data, anything which comes through, right? So those things could also come under breach. And more importantly, make sure that you're compliant from a cyber perspective. That was the core intention. But the way they drafted this, they've come up with what I could call it as 5 resilience goals, right? Which you can see on the screen. For example, evolve is a goal which is spread across, which means you need to have a continuous monitoring, right? Whereas on the other end, they've defined from a resilience perspective, anticipate, withstand, contain, recover, right? So contain and withstand, I put it under similar bucket they have because they have common requirements, but it is evolve, anticipate, withstand, and contain and recover. These are the 5 resilience goals. And when we talk about cybersecurity function, this is where the CSCRF has to be read together, right? It is the cybersecurity and the cyber resilience. So what you see on top is the cyber resilience. What you see one level below is cybersecurity, where it is again defined 6 buckets. And this is quite similar to what the NIST framework defines, right? The governance bucket, in fact, the NIST 2.0 defines that, only then they have added it. Otherwise, it was identity, protect, detect, respond, recover. So the governance bucket has been added. And it is all to do with your board, your policies, your risk management. Then comes identification. It talks about asset identification, risk identification, threat identification. Unless you know what your problems are, and it starts with understanding your inventory, etc. That's where identification comes in. And then comes the element of protect, the safeguard measures, right? It could be as simple as your backup. It could be as simple as an antivirus solution. It could be probably as complex as high level encryption, what you're enabling. So that's where protection comes in. And then comes detect. How are you able to identify attacks? Is there a way in which there is a monitoring system, right? And that's where your SOC comes into picture, your VAPT comes into picture, your cyber or internal audit comes into picture, and then you respond to it. And response over here is basically, if there's a detection mechanism, what is your response mechanism? And that's one of the core pillars from a resilience perspective. And last is recover, right? And recover comes into picture where your systems are restorable, your business continuity is taken care, your services impact is taken care, right? So those are the 6 functions and 5 resilience goals, which makes up this entire cybersecurity framework. And of course, within this, they've given standards, they've given some guidelines, they've given it into 4 sections broadly. It talks about standard, guidelines, some bit of annexures and reporting formats. That's basically how the entire guideline goes.
Got it. Got it. So basically, they don't want us to just countermeasure it. We need to be ready with the tools before a thing
Absolutely.
happens.
Absolutely.
Got it. So then this brings me to the next slide where I will ask you, who is this framework applicable to? Are there any exclusions? Are there any things that we can talk about in this broader framework?
So unfortunately, meet the way they have implemented is every registered player within the SEBI, right? This regulations is applicable. Please note, it is a registered entity with SEBI. That does not mean a listed company. Please get this clarity. You go for a SEBI registration, listed company, you go for a SEBI listing, not a SEBI registration. That's a different story, right? So the applicability is for every stock market intermediary, right? Who are those intermediaries? Those players whom you are seeing over here, right? It could be AIF, it could be bankers, it could be clearing corporation, KRAs, research analysts, portfolio managers, right? Stock brokers, stock exchange, venture capital funds, AIFs, VCF typically come within that bucket, right? So whom are some of the stakeholders who are part of this conversation, right? So all of you, typically this set of regulations stands applicable. But however, there are very small, minute category of people for whom they've said it is not applicable, right? And this could be foreign portfolio investors, FPI, or a foreign venture capital fund who does not have a SEBI registration here, right? But it's a foreign entity. Individual investment advisors. So if a corporate is doing an investment advising, you need to make sure you are adhering to it. Whereas if you're an individual, you have that bit of flexibility, right? Next, you have qualified depository participants where they're given the exemption. REITs are given the exemption. InvITs are given the exemption. Vault managers, and last but not the least, RTA, who's managing less than 10,000 folios, right? These are typically newly created RTA companies, or they're servicing a smaller players. So these are something which are excluded. I also want to remind one very important point. It might so happen that you may have 2 or 3 group entities. One is doing probably an AIF service. One is probably doing an asset management company. Another is probably doing just an investor advisory service, right? In all of these cases, if it is all under the common management, the highest of the regulations, or the stringent, whichever is the most stringent, that regulation would be applicable. So just people be aware. Don't say that, okay, something is not applicable, therefore I can escape. Unfortunately, no, applicability is definitely there.
Got it. Got it. Got it. So, because this session is more focused on the AIFs, can we just deep dive into how AIFs are covered in the framework? What is their
Sure.
exemptions or exclusions, etc.?
So if you recollect, I said there is something called as a graded approach basis on which these registered entities are categorized. So technically, what SEBI has done, SEBI has given 5 categorizations, right? What you see on the first line is the 5 categorizations which are applicable in general for all intermediaries. What you see on the second line is applicable only for AIF, right? So let me address the first line. The largest of the player, who are the institutions, come under MII, market infra institutions. These are typically your depository participants, stock exchanges, who are providing the whole of the infra for the entire stock market to operate. Minus them are the 4 largest buckets which can, or the 4 buckets, I will not use the word 4 largest, 4 buckets which is basically applicable. The largest amongst them is a qualified registered entity. Then you have a mid-size, small size, and a self-certification. As the name suggests, self-certification is you don't require any external person to give you an attestation. It's purely a self-certification basis you can perform that. Now, how do I decide on what basis I have to give this categorization? Now, each of the registered entity is based on a particular type of an asset, or the client, or the brokers, or the codes which they manage. For example, if you look into brokers, it is all about unique client records. We call them as UCC in the SEBI parlance. So the entire stock brokers is based upon the number of brokers, your unique client codes which you have. On the contrary, you look into people who are managing funds, right? Like the mutual funds, AMCs, or AIF. This would be applicable based on the AUM, right? And the AUM for this purpose would be obviously of the last audited financial statement, right? So given this particular situation, The first bucket, or the highest or the most stringent bucket, would be for qualified registered entities. And this is where your AUM is greater than 1,000 crores. Let me remind you, AUM is based on market value and not the cost, right? Because many times AIFs would have invested in a bunch of startups. Little do they realize that, the value in historical books would be a little different, right? Compared to that of the market value perspective. So AUM greater than 1,000 crores goes under the qualified RE. Anywhere between 500 to 1,000 crores, mid-size RE. If you're between 100 to 500, you come under small size. Less than 100 crore, you come under self-certification REs. So does that mean that self-certification, I just have to give a certificate? Hang on. It is not as simple. We'll discuss as we go along.
Got it. Got it. So again, now because you have expressed that how this is going to be applicable, where are the exclusions? Now we would want to know how are the timelines placed. Is it immediate? Do we have some time to borrow? How are the timelines placed on this phase?
Interestingly, these regulations came up, I think, somewhere around July, August, September, around that quarter of 2024. And there it clearly said 1st of January is the date for which you need to have all of these applicable. But they have clarified this is not applicable for all. This is applicable for only those entities where there is already an existing circular. So it's basically the circular is, old wine in a refined bottle, if I could probably use it, right? So that's where it's said. But however, in the last week of December, SEBI came up with a clarification. It said for those whom you see on the slide on the top, stock exchange, depository, CC, commodity, registered intermediaries, and investment advisors, for these stakeholders, SEBI gave you a sense of regulatory forbearance, which means they said it is applicable for you from 1st of January. However, I am okay if you have to defer it until March 31st, as long as you're able to showcase the way in which you are making your compliance journey met. And for the rest of the stakeholders, including AIF, the cutoff date is April 1, which probably is less than 27 days from today, right? So that's the cutoff date, so that people have to make sure that they are going to be adhering to this. And please note, it is the period for which you need to prove your compliance. So you don't start your compliance journey on April 1st. Keep that in mind. One last point between the old circular, which is, the one which is released in July or August 2024 versus SEBI clarification. It also said that data localization has been put on hold. So many of them, when they're providing services, assuming they have the servers in Singapore or maybe in Indonesia or even in the US for rendering these sort of services, the intention was to make it available only in the Indian servers, right? Of course, you might use the AWS Indian server, you can use the Microsoft Azure Indian server or the Google Indian server or even any of the equivalent, but it should be in an Indian server. That has been given some sort of a relaxation. The only logical reason is the data privacy rules came up in the beginning of January. There it is said that data localization, we will consider some amount of relaxation for a particular point in time.
Got it. So this is aligned with the other set of rules which are coming out, and I think for AIFs particularly, the timeline is just 27 days away. So a big alarm for all of us. Moving on to my next question, basically, how should an entity look at the framework in terms of planning, process, implementation, steps that they need to be following in order to be ready with those frameworks?
This question does not have a single answer because the entire guideline is about 200 plus pages, right? On an average, I have 25 days now, right? Excluding maybe some of the holidays, vacations, right? 20 effective days. Even if I read 10 pages per day, right? I would have probably just completed reading the regulations by end of March. But having said that, typically what we do is we follow a step-by-step approach, right? We do what is called as the gap assessment or a gap analysis. And here, the whole focus, right, before even we jump into the details of gap assessment, is requirement identification. because the framework is such wide that what is applicable and what is not applicable to decide that itself takes time. So we are spending a good amount of our time with our clients just identifying this. Of course, it's a one-time exercise. But remember, the moment you upgrade to a next category, some other things would be applicable for you, right? So that's the requirement identification. And then comes the element of gap assessment. Here, what we are doing is basically analyzing the requirement of the standard and seeing your process, whether you're following or not following. If you're not following, what is your compliance roadmap? What is it that I can define? Right? So that's basically the second one. And then comes the situation where we need to draft policies, we need to draft procedures, we need to identify tools. Very, very important. Remember, don't think this will stop with one person giving you some consulting exercise and ending the story. It's a sort of a recurring journey, right? So you need to identify those tools, vendors, and then implement, periodically monitor. And then you have to go for a certification or an annual audit. If you're an ISO, if ISO 27001 is required, you need to get that certification as well. So they have a bunch of these requirements, and therefore it is only the start of the journey. It is not the end. So यहाँ पर commas ज़्यादा है, full stop नहीं है.
Got it. And the time is running out. So we need to run against the time on this. So moving on, the next question would be, just give me a minute, I think something. Yeah. So the next question is, what are the requirements of each category? How do we look at those, and how do we navigate through those?
Lovely question. Now, one very important thing, if you remember, I told you, is not every player requires to do everything, right? The largest of the requirements will be for MII, market institutional in market institutions, basically the MII categories, who are providing the bunch of the infra related components. On the other end, you also have the four other categories which were made. The most stringent is the qualified RE. So the first column of MIA is just for reference, considering we have a lot of AIF entities over here. You come under the second, third, fourth, and fifth pillar, right? So if you are a qualified RE, you need to do what is called as a SEBI resilience assessment using CCI. That is basically a cyber capability index. For the first time, they've introduced something called as a cyber capability index, where there are about 18 or 20 odd areas. They've given you a weighted average score, and you're expected to rank yourself amongst that. And if your score is probably 40 and above, 50 and above, 60 and above, 70 above, 80 above, they've given a rating of yours. And that is interesting because it's going to be subjective, and this the CCI will be subject to an external audit as well, right? So we're talking about slightly an interesting way of looking at these things, right? Next comes your policy and cyber resilience, risk management related aspects. For all of them, this is mandatory. Annually, you need to do your review, make sure you are documenting it, make sure you have IT committee for registered entities, and at least one external independent cybersecurity expert have to be there. Right now, who is this player? What are the terms? You need to make sure you have engagement letters, his presence in the meetings, minutes of the documents, all of those things. And of course, you cannot go backdate and create certain things. So make sure that you've identified the stakeholders. Then you also have risk-based, threat-based assessment. Basically, for each of the risk REs, we'll have to do a threat modeling. If this is the cyber attack, what are the different types of issues which might occur, right? If this changes, what are the newer nuances which will come? So this is again a mandatory quarterly exercise for the top three. Then user access delegation review is a mandatory exercise for quarterly. Others, it is recommended. Then you have a mandatory security training program for everybody on an annual basis. Then functional efficacy of SOC. This is the first time this has been insisted, and very important, the SOC is applicable for all. And this SOC refers to Security Operations Center 24/7, which is monitoring your traffic. There is somebody who's appointed in some corner of the world who is probably, of course, this could be your own organization could have it. You could outsource it to a third party, or you can use what is called as an MSOC, market SOC, right? So many cases, depending on the client budget and other things, we are recommending between these models, so that clients are also, being practical that, not every money is going out to them, right? So the functional efficacy of that SOC also has to be measured half yearly basis for the top two, annual basis for the rest of them, right? And then you have a red teaming exercise. And a red teaming in simple language could be, if I could probably use the word, it is something like I'm creating a simulated attack, right? And you sort of identify that I have an enemy within my organization who is probably trying to use various tactics to identify this information. He may probably send a phishing email to see if somebody falls prey to it, right? So this whole setup is basically me appointing a bunch of ethical hackers to make sure that instead of external person identifying, I myself can probably deploy somebody to do that, right? So that's a red teaming exercise. Then you have a threat hunting exercise as well, which is also slightly similar. But what happens over here is you are ideally looking at what are the potential threats which could come up, right? It could be, how a person from an external world could capture the information, collect the data, create some sort of a hypothesis based on it, see some investigation if he has to do. So all of those things are typically what happens in a threat hunting. Then is your ISO 27001. This is a mandatory requirement for the top two. And interestingly, the top two are also insisting their vendors to make sure they're ISO 27001 compliant. The only relaxation in this entire provision is they've given within 1 year of this rule, you have to get it done. Please note 1 year of the rule. The rule was issued somewhere in July, August. So technically, we are still left with only 6 months, right? So if you fall under that. And a vulnerability penetration testing at least once a year has to be performed. And last but not least, the cyber audit from a certain empaneled auditor has to be performed, right? And for the top two, again, twice a year, for rest of them, once a year as it is required. For self-certification, Ari, as the name suggests, it is a declaration based on a format which they have to give, but otherwise it would not be applicable, right? So hopefully you got an idea, Meet. This is quite an intensive exercise. It's not that, okay, one size fits all. It's not that I can take these regulations lightly. I think it takes some time for me to decompose this and get started. And that's where I'll probably, give it back to you.
Got it. Got a lot of requirements, lot of categorizations. Moving on, the next question would be, how do we tackle those challenges? How do we resolve, uh, if SEBI has provided for these frameworks, how do the organizations go about it?
So technically, if you ask me, is there some cheat sheet which they have given? I don't think so, right? But the way we are typically approaching is decomposition of the larger problem statement into smaller buckets, right? Because the first and foremost is because there is a uniform cybersecurity framework, right? One way it is good, one way it is bad. So the way we are approaching is first delineating the scope. These are all the things which is not applicable, so therefore ignore that, right? Second, is the security assessments. It could be your technical capabilities, your CCI audits, etc. You need to address them, and that requires some amount of expertise and some amount of knowledge in terms of how this works, right? And the one saving grace which they have given, which I would have probably argued in January, it is a saving grace, not at this point in time, is that relaxation between January to March. But I still think that, April is around the corner, so I don't think we have too much time out there. From a data perspective, we have this localization of data. They've given some relaxation, right? So flexible with some amount of safeguards. So therefore that is okay. And risk management, make sure not only your risk management, your vendor risk management is also be looked at, right? Do you have a mechanism for real-time threat detection mechanism as well? So if you're able to bring up these together, right, I think you get that element or that flavor saying that, yes, I have done some of these and I may be in a position to address some of these challenges. But I think the best time to start this implementation was yesterday. But I think the next best time is today after our webinar is over.
Got it. Got it. So what are the consequences if somebody says, let's say, let's take a chance, not do it? How does SEBI is going to treat them?
So this is where there is slight ambiguity. Technically, the guideline does not talk about anywhere a penalty or a monetary clause which says you will be based on this, right? But however, knowing SEBI, right, typically under Section 11 of the SEBI Act, it has got a lot of powers. And that could be, it could implicitly using those provisions issue a notice. It can even go to an extent of issuing a cease and desist order, right? It could impact your organization's image when you say that I'm not compliant with this, right? And you could also have a situation where your clients are not going to be confident in case they are saying that, hey, you are not compliant and therefore I'm going to be a little skeptical. Please understand, we are seeing increasing number of participants are now becoming or joining part of the security market operations day in and day out. And we are seeing that on one side, even though the FIIs are taking off money in the stock market, right, we see a lot of inward money coming from the domestic players itself. And the inclusion pool has significantly increased. So if you want to be a differentiator, forget about differentiator. This is something which you have to be as a very basic requirement for you to survive the market, right? So therefore, from that perspective, it makes a lot of sense that yes, you go ahead and start implementing. Sometimes it might be an overkill. Am I testing it too much? But unfortunately, this is the law. I think we'll have to start going ahead.
So basically, since the provisions are not very direct, the framework is not more on the penal side. It is on how to do things, how to get the things done. This is going to be a big clarification requirement from the SEBI's end. So
Absolutely.
anything that you expect from a relaxation perspective that
At
the
this point,
guidelines
we
can be
don't have
further?
anything. Knowing the trends based on which we are seeing in the last few years. If something comes, it might come up in the last week of March, or it might probably even in that case be probably something to an extent of regulatory forbearance for another quarter or so, but not beyond that. So even if they come across, because the whole objective is that if they give deadlines, and if I keep postponing it, right? So it is clear
There is
or
no sense of
that
doing
nobody
anything.
wants to adhere to it.
Got it. Any representations that you are aware of have been made before
So
SEBI and
some representations have been made, and that's how the December regulations have probably got
pulled
slightly
back to
updated,
March?
right? So I'm guessing something similar might happen very soon. But even that happens, also I don't see a substantial reduction or relaxation. It should be probably not more than a quarter.
Perfect. I think that sets the tone for us to open the mic or the Q&A session for the audience. Thank you for listening us very carefully. Thank you, Nara, for giving us a brief insight on
Absolutely.
how this framework is going to affect, especially the AIFs and the participations in the SEBI ecosystem. I'll just check for question and answers and then take those up. I can see one question from Sahil. Sahil says that they are a new AIF fund, Cat 3, started 7 months back. How will the regulations be applicable to them? And I think if they are into the small fund category, which is less than the 100 crore AUM INR, they shall fall into the self-certification mode. I think it's self-answered it, but happy to listen from you, Nara, on this.
Sure, I think you answered it mostly right. So they will come under the self-certified self-certification mode, which will be called as a self-certification RE, because the AUM less than 100 crores will come under that, and I'm presuming they fall within that less than 100 crore, unless something substantial has gone through. In your case, my sense would be start addressing or focusing on those last column of items which we spoke of. There are about 3 to 4 self-certification bases, but there are mandatory policies, procedures which you need to define. There is also a mandatory requirement for you to have a SOC. In case SOC, and SOC here refers to the Security Operations Center, which has to have a 24/7 monitoring system. If you are not able to afford or not able to have a dedicated team because you are a smaller player, then there are market stock providers. I think you should probably contact them, or we are happy to set up a conversation on behalf of you, and get started with this implementation exercise step by step. And then over a point in time, I think you will reach there. And bear in mind one unfortunate thing, because you are the smallest player, you will grow eventually. So you need to keep a track of those compliances also, which would be applicable during the year. because the next year when they give you a certification, they will test what category you fall under and they will issue a report based on.
Perfect. Another question has popped up. Chandan Krishnan has asked a question to us that why is the framework applicable only for SEBI registered players? Is there any framework for general organizations?
Yeah, thanks, Chandan, for the question. As I said, the first and foremost rule is this is applicable for SEBI registered entities only. And the preamble or the definition or the categorization where they give these guidelines, they say there are about 19 odd players for whom it is applicable. You also saw that in a slide filled with boxes with different category names, right? So therefore, it is applicable only for them. For other players, you don't have something specifically given, but indirect references are there from a probably an internal audit or a statutory audit perspective, right? There is this indirect reference of a data localization for companies for in terms of a backup. There is this audit trail requirements which have come up for certain companies, right? So that way they're trying to provide. I would not say that every company they want to take something and fit into everybody's neck. It is practically impossible.
Got it. Another interesting question coming up from an anonymous attendee, I think more on a specific different regulator. They just wanted to know whether this would be extended to gift AIFs in future by their regulator called IFSCA instead of SEBI in that case.
Generally, the tendency is that whatever is there in the mainland, it will invariably get extended to the gift city. So it's a question of time. So the regulator would definitely go ahead and start initiating it. But I think you still have time. That's the only thing which I could probably say. But it is likely that these guidelines will give you a sense as to what is the expectation. If not this year, next year, the gift regulator might probably come up with it. So I think you will have to, it's only a question of time.
And I think from an AIF perspective, they have come up with something called as consultation paper for the cybersecurity
Yes.
frameworks that they want
There is a
proposed to bring
consultation
out.
paper from AIF
Yes.
perspective.
And I think for stockbrokers specifically, there's a live framework and a format which has been out by the regulator. So do watch out for that on this. Thank you so much for that question. Moving on to the next question, does the cybersecurity index require evaluation of the entity, reporting it to SEBI? If those kind of evaluations are to be performed, how do they see the ranking to be? This is the question from Sahil
Okay.
Jain.
Okay. Sahil, the way the framework is written, right? If you look into the CCI, one of the annexure pointers, it clearly says what is the rating and how one should probably look at the CCI perspective. So if you are having a CCI rating, I think less than 40% or so, right? Or 50%. 50 is treated as a benchmark. Then definitely all the eyeballs of the regulator will come on to you. So you need to make sure that you are having a score of more than 60 plus. And again, they've given a categorization what each of the score percentage refers to, right? So definitely attention of SEBI would come into picture when you have a lesser score. And this also becomes an initiative which you have to work on the subsequent period so that you will be able to do that. In fact, the less than 50 is treated as fail. So you need not to be thinking that only our CA Institute has this rule of less than 50 fail ho gaya, right? So hamara
Even the
SEBI
regulators are on the same page as the
SEBI
institutes.
also is on the same page. And they've said that if you're scoring anywhere between 51 to 60, that means you have a bare minimum security, right? And remember, so tomorrow SEBI will say, boss, disclose this all on your customer websites and other places, right? So it definitely has an implication. But this is applicable only for the top two, which is market institutions and qualified registered entity. For rest of them, you have some breathing space.
Got it. There is a top-up question from Sahil, who was the Cat 3 fund that we were talking about earlier, where he was just checking whether he should apply the SOC thing before 1st April or how do we do it? I think
So
he's
I'll tell you
also
Brian, the way if you, because you fall under, I think, the self-certification category. Imagine you did something even on the 2nd April or the 3rd April, right? There is a categorization which says, have you followed this throughout the year? So what will you say? I have followed this from 10th of April, right? So technically for 10 days, you are non-compliant. So the intention is to be compliant right from day one. If there are extreme situations where it is giving you that sort of you're not able to do it, then unfortunately you cannot. But otherwise, you have to make sure that you're compliant on every aspect which is applicable from April 1.
Perfect. I think Sahil will connect with you if you need any other support on this. Uh, the next question which has popped up right now is, are there any eligibility criteria specifically for the cybersecurity auditor
So
under
currently,
this
only a
regulation?
cert in auditor can do this. I'm talking
Okay,
about cyber security audit can be done only by a cert in auditor.
got it. I
And
think
don't
I
worry about
see.
that. We have a panel where we can always reach out, and therefore we can give you an end-to-end perspective of the requirements.
Perfect. Any other questions? Please feel free to write to us. This was an incredible session. I think a lot of discussions on the right direction has happened. The framework is a major step towards strengthening the cybersecurity uh, risk that the financial market would be exposed to. The compliance requirement for this audit is just not a regulatory requirement, but a very important one to build the whole financial ecosystem resilience overall. A huge thanks to Nara for sharing his deep insights on this. Thank you so much for the audience to keep us engaged. Feel free to write back to us. Our experts are there in order to guide you more. Uh, we'll keep hosting such detailed in talks webinars on various other topics. You can reach out to us on LinkedIn, on our website, incorporateadvisory.in, and other platforms where we're present on social media. Thank you so much for your valuable insights, Nara, again. And we should keep having such conversations, and we should stay vigilant, stay resilient, and have our systems on the right track as the regulators wants us to do.
Thank you. Thank you
Thank you
so much.
so much.
Take care.
We wind up the session with this, guys. Thank you so much for uh, patient listening to us. We are grateful. Thank you. Meet signing off for the day. Thank you.